point, and I do apologize for the fact that we're a little late. This is a special symposium sponsored by the ISSS, but also sponsored and supported by the John Templeton Foundation, and we're very pleased that they were willing to do this. And the title of this special symposium, as you know, is Can There Be a Reconciliation Between Science and Religion? And as you will see in the course of this evening, we have 4 extraordinary speakers to discuss the subject. The ground rules, if you will, for this evening is that each of the speakers will be allowed 20 minutes for a very brief presentation of what in most cases are a synthesis of book-length monographs on this subject. So I'm grateful that they're willing to try to get it into a 20-minute compass. Then each of the 4 speakers will have 2 minutes for a response to the other talks that they have heard. At that point, approximately at 90 minutes, counting my introductions, we will then open the floor to questions, et cetera, from the audience. And there are 2 microphones, so we ask you to step to the microphones to ask questions. And may I also ask you to make them brief, because we will not have that long for the discussion period, and we want to give everybody an opportunity. Also, I'd like to urge you to interact more with the speakers, and if you have a point or want to present some arguments of your own, I would urge you to hold those as much as possible until tomorrow afternoon, when the very last event of the World Congress ISSS 2000 meeting will be an open forum conducted by Elena Leonard, at which there will be ample opportunity for discussion of many things, but also especially the issues that are raised here this evening. So perhaps, given the fact that you'll have that much more expansive opportunity for discussion, that you will focus on utilizing the scarce resources, so to speak, of the speakers here this evening, and take advantage of their presence by directing questions to them as much as possible. So with that as a preface, let me just say a couple of words of introduction of my own. I was struck when the announcements came about the genome, the success of the genome project in mapping the entire genome. As I understand it, they weren't quite there, but if you put the 2 projects together, they were, but neither one had actually completely gotten there. So they had a press conference. And at that press conference, Clinton said, quote, "Today we are learning the language in which God created life." And Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, said, "We have caught the first glimpses of our instruction book, previously known only to God." And Dr. Craig Venter said, "The human spirit transcends the physiology that is controlled by the genome." So each in a different way expressed something that I think is very much in the spirit, if you will, of the forum that we are presenting here this evening. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. John F. Haught is Landeger Distinguished Professor of Theology at Georgetown University. His area of specialization is systematic theology, with a particular interest in issues pertaining to science, cosmology, ecology, and religion. He's the author of God After Darwin, A Theology of Evolution, Science and Religion, From Conflict to Conversation, The Promise of Nature, Ecology and Cosmic Purpose, and several other books. He's also the editor of Science and Religion in Search of Cosmic Purpose and numerous articles and reviews. He lectures often on the topics related to science, theology, and ecology. And he's recently established the Georgetown Center for the Study of Science and Religion. He's married, has 2 sons, and lives in Arlington, Virginia. Like Woody Allen, he believes there is a purpose in the universe except for certain parts of New Jersey.
Thank you, Peter. I have only 20 minutes, and I can only give you part of one of the many approaches that you could take to this question of whether science can be reconciled with religion or religion with science. If there's a God, I think that a slide will appear. Oh, yes, there it is. Okay. I don't know whether I can point to it and talk through this microphone at the same time, but I think it's helpful to start out by remembering that all of the religions of humanity, at least the dominant traditions, began before we had any sense of the evolutionary character of the universe. Most of these religions, the religions of our ancestors, arranged the universe in what we can call roughly a hierarchical way. And it was this hierarchical arrangement that allowed them to conceive of the universe as purposeful. Because as you move up from the lower levels, from the mineral, the plant, to the animal, the human, and then to ultimate meaning, each level can receive its meaning by being taken up into the next level, and that into the next, and then ultimately into ultimate reality and meaning, which in the West we would refer to as God. And this scheme operated according to what we might call the hierarchical principle. The hierarchical principle maintains that a higher level can encompass or comprehend a lower, but a lower cannot encompass or comprehend a higher. And what that would mean when you get up to the level of human consciousness is that if there is a purpose or ultimate meaning to the universe, by definition, we cannot have a clear conception of that. We cannot comprehend it in a clear and distinct way. Perhaps we might have an awareness of being comprehended by it. And that awareness of being grasped by meaning is what theologians mean by religion or by faith. And we would refer to that ultimate meaning in traditional religion only through symbolic expression. And there has to be inevitably a kind of fuzziness and vagueness to symbols because of the nature of the hierarchical principle. And that would mean also that cognitional competence at a lower level, such as scientific mastery of the inanimate level, does not qualify you to understand or comment in an authoritative way on the higher levels. And the reason for that is metaphysical, that as you go up the scale, the more real things are, the more being they have, the more elusive they would be. And that's why traditional religion did not have to apologize for the apparent absence or unavailability of God. And human life receives its meaning by being embedded in a whole network of relationships that are sacramental. They symbolically manifest ultimate reality. The universe is here for a reason, namely to set forth and express in some way its ultimate ground and depth, which we would call, in the West, we would call God. So could I have the next slide? Now let's transport ourselves abruptly to the contemporary scientific picture of the universe, and we can see that the hierarchical structure, the vertical hierarchical structure, gets sort of horizontalized and gets flattened out. And I think in many ways the problem of science and religion today is how you can map this horizontal scheme that I'm going to be talking about now onto the vertical scheme in which our traditional religions came about in the first place. We can talk about the cosmic story today as represented in 30 volumes, each volume 500 pages, each page standing for about 1 million years. And so you would have to imagine 20 more volumes over here, but picture 10 volumes on your shelf in your library. And in this is the last 5 billion years, the last 10 volumes of the story. In this story, the Earth would have come about somewhere in Volume 1, and life would have appeared somewhere early in Volume 4, 3.8 billion years ago. And then life would have remained pretty much at as what we would call a relatively simple stage until you get toward the end of Volume 9, where you have the famous biological Big Bang, the Cambrian explosion. And then in volume 10, the dinosaurs come in, around page 200 or so, and then they become extinct around 435. And then in these last 65 pages of the last volume, you have most of the interesting mammalian development that eventually led to the world of life we have today, the mammalian life we have today, and including to the primates and us. And notice about this scheme that life only gradually arises out of dead matter with no sharp breaks, and what we call mind or intelligence shows up only as on the last page or two of the very last volume. And if you're talking about Cro-Magnon type of Homo sapiens, that arises only in the last 2 or 3 paragraphs of the last page of the last volume. And it's not hard to look at this scheme and wonder what is going on. What is the point of it? Can we implant any sort of sense of purpose, as the traditional religions had in their cosmology, on this horizontal type of scheme? I like to remember a quote from Bertrand Russell, who, when he beholds this, said, if the purpose or the point of the universe was to produce intelligence, then why did it take so long to produce so little? And so could I have the next slide, please? As if the horizontalizing of the hierarchy isn't enough, we also have in modern times what I like to call the atomizing of it. You have a revival of atomism. Atomism is the method of specifying things or understanding them by breaking them down into their subordinate particulars, which is an ancient temptation that goes back to the Latin and Greek philosophers, especially Democritus. For a number of centuries, atomism was suppressed, you might say, by the dominance of Aristotelian and Platonic thought, which thought that the reality of things consists much more in their form than in their material components. But atomism came back in the modern period, starting with the birth of classical physics, the particles in motion universe of Galileo and Newton. And you find in evolutionary science now, today, a kind of combination of the horizontalizing approach plus with the molecular biology and sociobiology and all the rest, a kind of atomistic approach to life as well. While we're talking about atomism, it's tempting to look at molecular biology because it breaks life down into amino acids and nucleic acids, which are in turn reducible to chains of atoms, as a significant reason for atomizing the hierarchy. Also sociobiology, which Michael Ruse can talk about. Neuroscience, trying to specify mind, which was way up on the hierarchy before, to try to understand that as much as possible in terms of what traditionally was the lowest level, that of the molecular makeup of things. So that and a number of other things, which I won't go into, the modern expulsion of mind from nature, going back to Descartes, who separated mind from matter, which implies that matter, therefore, is fundamentally mindless, and nature came to be thought of in the modern period as essentially mindless matter, which makes it very congenial to a kind of atomistic type of understanding. The ideal of impersonal knowing, which increasingly saw the universe itself as impersonal, also allows for an atomistic way of looking at things. Now, a lot of these things would not be problematic, except for the fact, and there's nothing problematic religiously or theologically about classical physics, molecular biology, and even sociobiology. It's only when they get combined or conflated with certain kinds of beliefs, like scientism, which is the belief that science is the only road to truth, or materialism, which is the belief that matter is the ultimate reality or the ultimate ground of all things, or reductionism, which thinks that the only adequate way to explain things is to break them down into their subordinate particulars. So all this modern revival of atomism leads, along with the horizontalizing, to a kind of collapse of that traditional hierarchy, which was the context or the edifice within which purpose came to be expressed originally. And I think that's our problem primarily today. And the problem of science and religion is in many ways the problem of whether you can in some way retrieve a hierarchical understanding, maybe not expressed in this rigid vertical way, but in some sense a kind of nesting of systems by larger systems and so forth. Can you retrieve that today in the light of the horizontalizing and atomizing of the traditional hierarchy? So could I have the next slide? I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but I thought I would just say a few words about 3 scientific thinkers who have thought a lot about this and have themselves a deeply religious understanding of reality as well, and just give you a sense of how they work with this issue. One of them is the philosopher and scientist Michael Polanyi, a Hungarian-born physical chemist who was chased out of East Europe by the Nazis and came to England, taught for many years at the University of Manchester and then later at Oxford University. And what Polanyi, to make a long story short, decided was that there's no logical contradiction between an evolutionary horizontalizing of things or atomizing of things represented by this unbroken line here, and the coming onto the scene in a quiet and undetectable way of information. And information, the coming of information into the situation, allows us to have an ontological and logical discontinuity represented by these broken lines here, which is logically compatible with the continuum represented by the unbroken line here. Could I have the next slide, please? Just to make this point clear, he suggests, here I'm adapting something from an analogy that he gives us. Imagine that you're scribbling in red ink on a piece of paper in that first part of the box here, and you draw a sharp line here, and then suddenly you break into writing a sentence. Not a very interesting one, but nevertheless a coherent one. Now, from the point of view of chemistry, nothing is going on over here that's not going on over here. So there's chemical and physical continuity here, but the chemical or physical continuity does not exclude informational discontinuity. If anybody knows how to read, they can see that clearly something is going on over here that's not going on over here. So likewise, he would say the introduction of information into this box here violates no chemical or physical law. So the sciences of chemistry and physics are not going to be able to detect this informational sequence because that's not what they're interested in. Likewise, by analogy, he would argue that if there were a cosmic purpose, and he believes there is, the presence of it, the incarnation of it, the embedding of it in the cosmic reality would not interrupt any laws of science and therefore would not be detectable by any laws of science as well. Can I have the next slide, please? Just to make this very concrete in terms of DNA, if you'll excuse the very simple diagram I have here, Polanyi would argue right here in the DNA molecule we have a hierarchical structure. You have at the lower level the chemical determinism that bonds the elements, the chemical elements together in an invariant, predictable, reliable, deterministic way. So determinism is operating here, but at the same time this determinism is not so rigid that it rules out a kind of freedom for information to become embodied in an indefinite variety of ways at a higher level. What's really interesting about the DNA molecule to Polanyi in a hierarchical sense is not the chemistry, although that's interesting in itself too, but the specific sequence of letters in the code, which is what makes one organism a rat, another cockroach, another human being. So there's already a kind of hierarchical arrangement here. So he sees no logical incompatibility between a hierarchical implantation of meaning in the universe and the horizontalizing and atomizing. You can have them both, but just look at them as operating in different ways at different levels. Have the next slide, please. Another thinker that has dealt with this issue is the French Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, who spent most of his life trying to show that evolution is the most appropriate framework for understanding a religious sense of meaning and purpose. He lived from 1881 to 1955. I'm sure you've been talking a lot about complexity at this conference, but Teilhard was one of the first scientists in this century really to emphasize the importance of complexity in the universe. And the way he pictures purposes coming in is, it's almost in a measurable way in his thinking, because as you move from the pre-atomic through the atomic, molecular, cellular, organismic, vertebrate, primate, and human, you have a gradual increase in measurable, organized, physiological complexity. But what he wants to point out is that parallel to that, generally speaking, there is a rise in the temperature of consciousness as well. Now, why would that be a sign of a purposive universe? Well, for Teilhard, you have to remember his scholastic background, and for a Thomistic philosopher, consciousness and being are correlative notions. Consciousness is by definition a value, a high value. And if purpose means the orientation of a process toward the realization of a value, then the universe which realizes over time the value of consciousness is self-evidently, for Teilhard de Chardin, a purposive universe. If you're having any doubts about whether consciousness is a value, Teilhard would say, remember that it's your own consciousness that's putting that in doubt. You cannot help but value your own consciousness as you criticize this, because criticism and doubt require an implicit belief in the value of consciousness. Can I have the next slide, please? Alongside of the emergence of the complexity and consciousness in the universe, there's also something fascinating going on, and that's increased socialization and centration, emergent freedom, openness to the future. But let's just concentrate here on centration. From the very beginning, matter in the universe has had a tendency to cluster around a center. It's a fascinating thing. You find it in the atom, the nucleus of the atom, in the eukaryotic cell. You find it in the development of the central nervous system in vertebrates and its intensification in primates. And when you get to humans, you have a reality which can take trillions of synaptic connections and integrate them into the subjective, white-hot intensity of that first personal pronoun, I. So there's clearly a centration going on. Now, for Teilhard, this centration, we can't assume that this centration process or tendency is going to stop just because we're here. In fact, centration now takes a new form, on our planet at least, and this is where Teilhard brings in religion. This is how he integrates religion with science. He sees religion as not something exceptional at all, but religion is the way in which the cosmos, now that it has reached the human phase of development, continues its ageless tendency to search for a center. In a sense, the definition of religion is a search for the center. So religion fits very smoothly into the cosmos, and the meaning of our own lives is to continue to promote this process of centration. That's how we express our fidelity with the evolutionary process. And Teilhard sees the religious search of humanity as an ongoing cosmic search for that center, which gives meaning and significance to things. I think I have one more slide. Let me just quote Teilhard here briefly. He says, what is most vitally necessary to the thinking earth is a faith, and a great faith, and ever more faith. To know that we are not prisoners, to know that there is a way out, that there is air and light and love somewhere beyond the reach of all death. To know this, to know that it is neither an illusion nor a fairy tale. And for Teilhard, it was something that he arrived at because of his integration of evolution and his religious faith. That if we are not to perish smothered in the very stuff of our being is what we must at all costs secure. And it is there, he says, and this is my point, it is there that we find what I may well be so bold as to call the evolutionary role of religions. Do we have time, or am I out? Well, let me just have the one last slide, and let me just mention, can I have the next slide, please? Just one more thinker. I can't go into him in much detail, but his name is Alfred North Whitehead, famous British mathematician, scientific thinker, philosopher. Eventually came to the United States and taught at Harvard. He also reflected on the evolutionary character of the universe a lot, and he thought that what we can learn from science is that the cosmos has always been discontent with the status quo. But why has it been discontent with the status quo? He thinks because it has an aim toward more and more intense versions of beauty. And since beauty is a transcendental value, a process which is oriented toward or aiming toward the production of beauty can be called, in a general sense, purposive. By beauty, he means a synthesis of order and novelty. And he understands, he brings in the idea of God, not to explain just order, which is the habit of design arguments in theology that's opposed to Darwin, but God is also the source of novelty. And novelty tends to disturb order and disturb design. And so his God is a God who's not content with the status quo and is very comfortable with an evolutionary kind of of universe. And this God also acts in a persuasive rather than a coercive way. And since God is persuasive and divine love, if God is love, God has to be persuasive rather than coercive. Then the persuasive character of divine influence would allow for the chance, the randomness that's such a scandalous thing to design arguments, for the freedom that we experience in our own self, for the indeterminacy that you find at the subatomic level and so forth. So we should not be surprised that we live in a universe that has this capacity for spontaneity. And God's will or God's purpose in this way of looking at things is the maximization of beauty. So I'll just stop there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and I'm sure we'll want to follow up with that. Our next speaker, Kenneth Miller, professor of biology at Brown University, is first and foremost a distinguished cell biologist. He was educated, got his PhD from the University of Colorado, has taught at Harvard and Brown, and he's been a full professor at Brown, my alma mater, since 1986. So I have a special affinity for his being on this panel tonight. He's the recipient of numerous honors for teaching excellence. He's a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Society for Cell Biology. He's also served as editor of the Journal of Cell Biology and the Journal of Science, and general editor of Advances in Cell Biology. His scientific interests include the structure, composition, and function of biological membranes, electron microscopy, and associated techniques in photosynthetic energy conversion. He's published a large number of technical scientific papers in this area and has co-authored several widely used high school and college biology textbooks. Recently, only recently, I guess I should say, he has turned to publishing something that is clearly not customary in his discipline, and that is a work defending evolution and its compatibility with religious faith. A remarkable book called Finding Darwin's God. And A Scientist's Search for Common Ground Between God and Evolution is the subtitle. It's HarperCollins, 1999. And it is with great pleasure that I invite Professor Miller to the podium.
A little bit concerned about the video projector back there. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for coming, and the organizers of this Congress for inviting me and giving me a chance to be on this very distinguished panel. Being a biologist, the first thing that comes to my mind in terms of reconciliation between science and religion has to do with two of the pictures on the slide there, Charles Darwin and the creation picture, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I come to this in an interesting way. As you've heard, I'm a cell biologist. That picture in the upper right-hand corner is the cover of Cell, which had one of my electron micrographs on it a couple of years ago. I sent a copy to Mom and Dad and my brother and everybody else because I wanted to let them know. I've also written a number of textbooks which are widely used in the U.S. and Canada and a few other countries, and some of those covers are shown there. Writing a biology textbook can be a strange experience. I live in a town called Rehoboth, Massachusetts, which is a rural town east of Providence and south of Boston. It's about 6,000 people. We govern by what in the U.S. is called New England Town Meeting, which means on the second Monday of every April, all the citizens pile into the high school gymnasium, and we vote laws, zoning restrictions, and we vote line by line on the town budget. It's democracy in its best form and also democracy in its worst form, and I can tell you lots of stories about it. But in this town, a lot of people know who I am, for two reasons, one of which is I have a tendency to shoot my mouth off at town meeting, And the second thing is, for about 8 years, I was kind of like the commissioner of girls softball in Rehoboth. I organized the leagues, and I coached our all-star teams and trained the umpires, so everybody knew Mr. Miller as the softball guy. But nobody really knew what I did for a living. And then one day, the local high school adopted one of those textbooks, the one with the elephants on the cover, and it has a lot of my pictures in it, and people discovered that I was a scientist and that I taught at Brown University and that I had written this book. So one day I'm picking my daughter up after sports practice in the fall, and I drive up to the school, and one of the friends I knew from softball is standing there, and she says, "Ken," she flags me down, she says, "Ken, you wrote the book that they use in the high school now." And I got that sort of big dumb look that you get on your face when you think someone's about to compliment you. And I said, "Yes, it's true." And then she said, "You know, the funny thing is you don't seem that smart." That is something that I will leave for you to judge for yourself. It is some fear of what your verdict will be. I'm here tonight in part because of events. And that is that evolution, certainly in my country, the United States, is a major public issue. Some of you may know that the school board, the elected school board of the state of Kansas, last summer doctored up the science curriculum in the state of Kansas by removing from it all reference to evolution from the life science standards. From the earth science standards, they removed all reference to the age of the earth. From the astronomy standards, they removed all reference to the size and age of the universe and from the Big Bang. And believe it or not, and chemists must have thought they were safe from all this being a non-controversial science, they didn't much like the way in which the second law of thermodynamics was described, so they rewrote the second law of thermodynamics in a way that would forbid increases in order and complexity. I don't know what the end result of this will be. I spent 3 days last week in Kansas on behalf of a committee called Kansas Citizens for Science Education, and there is a primary election for school board next month, and as they explained it to me, it was democracy that got us into this problem, and it is democracy that will get us out. I hope that they are right. The book that I wrote and some of the speaking that I do increasingly has centered around defending evolutionary biology against many of its scientific critics. And in this slide, I've sort of pasted up 3 lines of criticism that have appeared in the U.S. and around the world in the last couple of years. The scientific creationists on the left, who argue that the Earth is young, 6,000 or 7,000 years old, give or take a few hundred, and that natural history is an illusion. All the geologists are wrong about the age of the Earth and the geological ages. Philip Johnson, upper right-hand corner, a lawyer at the University of California at Berkeley, argues that evolution has hidden assumptions of philosophical materialism that make it inherently anti-theistic and that the mechanism of evolution doesn't work. And in the lower right-hand corner, Michael Behe, a biochemist at Lehigh University, says that whatever else it can explain, evolution cannot explain the biochemical complexity of the living cell. Well, in a sense, one can answer all these techniques, and one can answer all these challenges. And some people ask me if it becomes tedious to answer challenges. I don't find it tedious, I find it exhilarating, because I think it's always useful to examine one's assumptions. One of the criticisms of the scientific creationists, for example, is that so-called transitional forms are missing or absent from the fossil record. The statement I have in quotations is from the National Academy of Sciences, and as they like to point out, so many intermediate forms have been discovered between fish and amphibians, amphibians and reptiles, reptiles and mammals, and along the primate lines of descent, that would be us, that it is often difficult to identify categorically when the transition occurs from one to another particular species. And of course, I can give examples of this. The criticism that we don't know anything about the mechanisms of evolution becomes sillier every single day. In this particular slide, I've simply pasted in some recent papers from Science and Nature documenting the fact that we actually know a great deal about the mechanism of evolution. My favorite one is in the upper right, actually. It's called The Evolution of an Antifreeze Glycoprotein. It concerns the fact that Antarctic fishes, fish that live under the Antarctic ice cap, are able to survive there because they have antifreeze in their blood. They have the biological equivalent of ethylene glycol. And interestingly, with the rapid increase in genome sequencing in the last couple of years, we even know where they got it from, which was a gene that normally codes for a digestive enzyme, was duplicated, retargeted, and then mutated to gradually make a more and more efficient antifreeze protein. So we know more, and we know more every day. Michael Behe at Lehigh University is the guy that says evolution can't explain biochemical complexity, and to say what he means by that. He says, and this is a quote from a book of his, that as you search the professional literature, you will not find any step-by-step Darwinian explanation of the evolution of a complex biochemical system. And he says the reason you can't find them is because it's not possible, and therefore evolution cannot explain the evolution of biochemical complexity. Is he right about that, or is he wrong? Well, I'm sure that all of you who remember back to your days in secondary school, in gymnasium, in university, remember with great fondness the Krebs cycle. During your studies of biology, the Krebs cycle being sort of the complex biochemical center of metabolism. It's the most dreaded topic in the freshman biology course that I teach because of its complexity. It's an interlocking pathway with 9 enzymes and 4 cofactors. If you're missing any part, it doesn't work anymore. How could it possibly have evolved? Well, as it turns out, Behe has made that point, that complex machines cannot evolve. He says no one's published so much as a single paper showing that, but it turns out that in 1996, a group of authors did in fact publish a paper explaining in detail the step-by-step Darwinian biochemical evolution of the Krebs cycle. And there are other examples as well. So Professor Behe's charges on this score, they sound convincing until you actually start to look at the literature and you discover that evolution has found that sort of thing. One of the points that I made in my book is that evolution's predictions in pure scientific terms are testable. Because once we invoke Darwin's mechanism, we place testable constraints on natural history. And what I wrote here is, for example, if organisms show common ancestry, then we ought to be able to find a nested series of relationships between existing organisms, which in fact we do. We should find that novel organs and structures are found only in the actual descendants of the species in which they first appeared, and that's also true. And finally, and most importantly, we should find a consistent pattern of ancestor-descendant relationships that expands as we fill in new discoveries in the fossil record, and we have. Now, opposition to evolution, I would maintain, persists despite an accumulation of scientific evidence. And I pasted in here a cover from Time magazine in the U.S. last summer on the new fossil evidence for the evolution of our own species, the human species, and let it suffice to say that for a general purpose magazine, they did an extraordinarily good job of summarizing the scientific evidence, which is overwhelming. I think I know why. The dialogue between science and religion on the issue of evolution is so difficult. And I think part of the problem, a large share, has to do with the scientific community itself. And specifically, and I'll read a quotation here from a person whom I much admire, Doug Fatuma, from one of his textbooks on evolutionary biology. And Doug says that by coupling undirected, purposeless variation to the blind, uncaring process of natural selection, Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of the life processes superfluous. And if you're a religious person, that's going to worry you. Many leading evolutionary biologists, skipped one, assert that science can and should put an end to all value systems that include moral principles. Bill Provine, a philosopher of science at Cornell in the U.S., says modern science directly implies that there are no inherent moral or ethical laws, no absolute guiding principles for human society. Daniel Dennett, his quotation on the right, Daniel Dennett looks forward to the day when we can break the bonds of religion and thereby invalidate all moral systems. And some scientists, including Richard Dawkins and David Hull from the UK, even think that evolution allows them to draw theological conclusions, as long, of course, as those theological conclusions are anti-theological. David Hull's on the right says the God of the Galapagos, meaning the God implied by evolution, is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He certainly is not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray. Now, what's the proper scientific, if not religious, response to this? I think the proper scientific response is to say, when you say these things, you may believe them, you may find them reasonable, and they may be your opinions, but they're not science. And to pretend that an obligatory conclusion as a result of evolutionary science or anything else in science is inherently anti-theological, I think is wrong, and is the source of enormous anxiety as to how people regard science today. Now, I'm not exactly the first person to think that way. Somebody thought of that first, and that person's name is Charles Darwin. Darwin actually wrote in The Origin that he saw no reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feelings of anyone. And he points out that he thinks, and a noted clergyman has written him and said that he thinks it's just as noble to imagine a deity who created a few forms capable of self-development as to believe that he required a fresh act of creation constantly throughout history to supply the voids caused by the actions of his laws. Ian Barber, the very distinguished scholar of religion and scientist, wrote, and I think he's right on the money, both the scientific materialist and the scientific creationist have failed to respect the proper boundaries of science. The former makes statements about religion, as if they were part of science. The latter makes statements about science that are dictated by religious beliefs. And both points of view are invalid. Now, religious people often tell me that they have several problems with evolution they can't get around. And I am going to honor your request to finish it in the time I should, so I'm going to cover as many of these as I can, and I will skip a few. Here are 6 of them, and I think there's 6 big ones. 1, evolution contradicts the Genesis story of creation. I'm going to talk that one last. 2, the chance, random nature of evolution rules out a divine plan. 3, its naturalistic mechanism leaves nothing for God to do. 4, why did God take so long? You heard that previously from Jack Haught. 5, the cruelty of the struggle for existence is incompatible with a loving God. And 6, it's even inconsistent with the character of the Christian God. Let's take number 2 first. Evolution is indeed unpredictable, but that does not mean it's random. Natural selection is not random at all, and that's an important thing to understand. Second, chance is genuine, and chance affects the lives of all of us. And that's true whether one is a religious person or not. Chance leads to contingent histories, and all histories, political, human, and natural, are contingent processes. And what this means, in a sense, is that the contingent and unpredictable nature of historical processes, including natural history and evolution, leaves the future open and undetermined. Now, why is that important? I'm going to quote the preceding speaker, Jack Haught. It's important because of what it means about human freedom. And Jack writes that even Thomas Aquinas argued that a world without chance could not really be distinct from God. Aquinas wrote it would be contrary to the nature of providence and the perfection of the world if nothing happened by chance. So the randomness and undirected features of evolution are not just apparent, they are in fact essential features of any world created by a gracious God. I couldn't have said it any better myself. I wish I had said that. My 5th point, because I wanted to skip a few so I can fit in time, is the idea that the struggle for existence is so cruel that it's incompatible with a merciful God. Now, there's an interesting thing going on here, and that is that all organisms are born to die, and that's an observable fact. It's not just an invention of Darwinism. In a material world, life comes only at the cost of death. And I want to remind you, because I'm a plant cell biologist, that even if you only had salad tonight, your life comes at the expense of the death of another organism, which is to say the plants that you ate. And that's a fact, and that's not an invention of Charles Darwin. And lastly, just as sin is defined by virtue, the struggle for existence, from it comes the evolutionary possibility of perfection. Point 6 was that evolution is inconsistent with the character of the Christian God. I don't agree with that. The alternative to an evolving world is one that is fixed and static. The message of a Christian God is one of redemption. These values are inconsistent with a fixed creation, and therefore evolution, as a science of biological possibility, is perfectly consistent with the Christian theology of spiritual possibility. I wanted to rush to the big one. Genesis contradicts the Genesis story of creation. And I'm going to sort of skip this just for a second and get right to the point. I would maintain that assertions that Genesis, even a literal reading of Genesis, requires a creation ex nihilo are actually inconsistent with a literal reading. And I've pasted up a few verses from Genesis 1. And you will see the first one, God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass." Now you can read through the others for yourself, but you'll see that constantly creation is mentioned, even in the King James translation, as a command for the earth or the waters to bring forth creatures. Here's Genesis chapter 2. Man is formed out of the dust of the ground. Remarkable statement about the chemistry of our body. And once again, the command is that out of the ground the Lord commanded or made. The language of Genesis does not support an instantaneous puff of smoke, fully formed creation, but rather the command of the Creator to the waters and the air and the earth to bring forth life, something that I find remarkably consistent with evolution. Should you read the Bible in terms of reconciling science and religion as a science textbook? I don't think so. And I'm not the first person to come to that conclusion. St. Augustine in 411 AD, and whatever else you say about Augustine, you cannot call him an apologist for Darwin. Augustine wrote, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, the kinds of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. Think about what he just said. He just said astronomy, biology, geology, and so forth. He's talking about science. And the non-Christian knows this knowledge in an empirical way. Now it is a disgraceful and a dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to present such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. And I would argue that's essentially what's going on in Kansas today. This is Augustine making the further point of how important it is to keep people from doing this. And the ultimate danger of such predictors is not to science, but their ultimate danger is that they would dishonor religion. My theological point is that evolution was much more than an indirect pathway to get to you and me, and by choosing evolution as his way to fashion the world, the Creator emphasized our material nature and our unity with other forms of life. He's made our choices matter, our actions genuine, our lives important. He used evolution as the tool to set us free. And I would add once again that Jack Haught has said this in a remarkable way. He says that the God of evolution doesn't fix things in advance. He doesn't hoard the joy of creating. Instead, he shares with all creatures their openness to an indeterminate future. Can there be a reconciliation between science and religion from the point of view of evolutionary biology? And the answer, I think, is certainly yes. And I think that can be done in a very simple way. And that is for scientists to avoid pronouncements about religion, and for religionists to avoid pronouncements to tell natural scientists what they must find out when they investigate nature. And if that is done, and if it's done appropriately, not only can there be a reconciliation between science and religion, but I would submit in a very simple way that each can lend its meaning to the other. Thank you very much.
It has been frustrating for me twice in a row now to have to cut a speaker short, and I'm sure you must feel the same way. But we need to move on to our third speaker. Joel Primack earned a bachelor's degree in physics from Princeton and a PhD from Stanford. He was a junior fellow of the Society of Fellows of Harvard from 1970 to 1973. He then joined the faculty of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and has been professor of physics there since 1983. Professor Primack is one of the world's leading cosmologists. He's one of the main inventors and developers of the theory of cold dark matter, which has become the basis of the standard theory for the formation of structure in the universe. He has in recent years been testing cosmological theories using supercomputers to simulate and visualize hypothetical universes and comparing the distribution of galaxies in them with the actual universe we observe. He has also done fundamental work in elementary particle physics and nuclear physics. He has supervised graduate research by more than 25 students, and he's also a fellow of the American Physical Society and of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and has been the recipient of a Humboldt Award from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. I could go on, but I would like to just mention in particular that he has participated in programs on science and Judaism, and he's been both an advisor and participant in the Science and Spiritual Quest program of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences, and has, since February of this year, has been the chairman of an advisory committee of the ISSS in their program of a dialogue on science, ethics, and religion. Would you welcome Dr. Primack?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Could I have the first transparency? Thanks. As this shows, I'm going to talk about two different subjects. The first is that ISSS program that I chair the advisory committee for, the program of dialogue on science, ethics, and religion. And I'll talk about what we're trying to do, what we've accomplished so far, and the challenges, both the challenges that we face as a program, but also the challenges that we faced to the existence of this program, since the idea that science and religion should be discussed within the subject, within the context of the American Association for the Advancement of Science is somewhat controversial. What I then want to do is to talk about one particular subject, the one that I work on, cosmology, and to talk about how modern cosmology can, as I say, nourish the spiritual imagination. And in the limited amount of time that I have, I'm just going to give a couple of excerpts from material that my wife, Nancy Ellen Abrams, and I have been developing for a course that we've been teaching at the University of California, Santa Cruz, called Cosmology and Culture, and that we're trying to work up into a book. Can I have the next transparency? Now, I'm not going to have time to tell you very much about the ISSS program, but I did want to advertise that we have a website which you can easily find. You just go to the ISSS main website, www.iisss.org. ISSS, of course, is the big scientific society, the largest in the world. We publish Science magazine. We have an annual meeting, which is the big science conference of the year. Within ISSS, there's something called the Science and Policy Programs Directorate, and within that is the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. Among the various things that you'll find at the website is one of the best, maybe the best, website on evolution, including, among other things, a talk that has many of the same transparencies that you just saw in Kenneth Miller's wonderful presentation that you just heard, called Finding Darwin's God. So that's linked to this website. That's a talk that he gave at a conference that we sponsored, that we co-sponsored at the University of Kansas. Next transparency, please. Well, that's just a list of the names of the members of the advisory committee, and it's probably too small to read anyway. Mainly, I just wanted you to appreciate that there are many scientists and also many people coming from religion, both theologians and people who work with, for example, the Conference of Catholic Bishops. Next. This is the official mission statement of the ISSS Program of Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. The program was chartered by the governing body of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the board, and the members of the advisory committee are appointed by the board. The mission is to promote knowledge about developments in science and technology among those professionally concerned with ethics and religion, for example, by organizing conferences and public forums and by publishing books, videos, and other informational material, to provide opportunities for dialogue on matters of mutual concern between scientists, ethicists, and religious scholars and leaders by convening discussion groups and providing other opportunities for exchange. And finally, facilitating collaboration among scientists, ethicists, and religious scholars and leaders on projects that explore ethical and religious implications of scientific and technological developments. So these include religious research seminars, workshops, and other cooperative ventures. Next transparency. Well, it's probably hard to read this, so let me read a few of these. These are the things that have so far come out of our activities. There are many more that are in progress. The books are An Evolving Dialogue, Scientific, Historical, and Philosophical and Theological Perspectives on Evolution, Perspectives on Genetic Patenting, Religion, Science, and Industry in Dialogue, Unprecedented Choices, Religious Ethics at the Frontiers of Genetic Science. That's a book by Audrey Chapman, who heads the program on science, ethics, and religion. Consumption, Population, and Sustainability, Perspectives from Science and Religion. That's the proceedings of one of the first conferences held under the auspices of the program. Preparing for Human Genetic Modification Across Generations, Ethical, Religious, Scientific, and Policy Perspectives. This is based on a series of working groups that we've had, and that'll be coming out shortly. And then 2 books that are based on conferences that we held, The Epic of Evolution, which was held in Chicago at the Field Museum, I think 3 years ago, and Cosmic Questions, which was held last year in Washington, D.C. at the National Museum of Natural History. And then reports that are coming out, not book length, but shorter, Stem Cell Research and Applications, Monitoring the Frontiers of Biomedical Research. This just came out, and it's available online through our website. And then shortly, Inheritable Genetic Modification. Well, there are many more in progress, but this gives you an idea that we've been busy. These are all topics that involve important scientific and technological advances that have important religious and ethical dimensions. Next transparency, please. This was the website for the Cosmic Questions Conference, and that's still available through our website, and that has links to various things. The 3 main topics, each one the focus of one day at this conference, which took place in April of last year. Did the universe have a beginning? Is the universe designed? Are we alone? In the Is the Universe Designed day, there was, as there was each day, a debate. There were some talks leading up to it, giving background, and then talks afterward exploring the implications. The debate itself received a lot of attention. John Polkinghorne, a physicist and Anglican priest, versus Steve Weinberg, a physicist and self-appointed atheist. And I think each made a very articulate presentation of their viewpoints, which was, I think, the point. We not only will have a book coming out of this, but also a CD-ROM that will include not only excerpts from those debates, but also interviews with all of the participants. Next transparency. I said that we face challenges in this program. There have been several requests to abolish the program, which were taken up by the Board of Directors of AAAS and then more recently by the Council of AAAS. The board is a small group, about 10 people. The council is about 100 and represents all the different parts of AAAS. In each case, after much deliberation, the program was heartily endorsed. And in fact, after the council debate, which was chaired by the outgoing president and incoming chairman of AAAS, Steve Gould, the program actually got its first line item budget from the AAAS central office. Up until then, it had been subsisting entirely on money that it had raised from foundations. So I think that you should understand that the American Association for the Advancement of Science does think that this is a good idea, this program. The challenges have been, I think, 3 basic types. One has been the source of funding. The program started with a large grant, a little over $1 million, from the Templeton Foundation. And some people object to Templeton Foundation funding. I'm not quite sure why. The Templeton Foundation is the biggest funder in the area of science and religion, and they have given hardly any restrictions on how we use the money, except that they don't support anything in the area of environment. That's fine. We do what we think is appropriate, and we raise money from other sources. ISSS has said that we should receive no more than 40% of our total funding from any one source, including Templeton, and that's pretty close to what we're at right now. So Templeton is not contributing even the majority of our funding. But both ISSS and the advisory board see no reason why we shouldn't accept money from Templeton and others. Now, the other two challenges or questions about this program, I think, can be summarized as saying that why bother with religion? Religion is outmoded. And that another viewpoint has it that science and religion are naturally antagonistic. Why invite the enemy into our hallowed chambers, we scientists? On the first issue, I would say that religion is certainly not outmoded, although mainline church membership is declining in the U.S. and maybe also in Canada. There's certainly tremendous sales of books and other vehicles indicating a hunger for spirituality. And the rise of fundamentalism is, I think, one of the most important worldwide phenomena. It has, of course, a negative aspect. More people are being killed now in religious wars than in any other kind of war. But in domestic politics in the United States, the main concern has been the attack of fundamentalist religion on Darwinism and the other historical sciences. Those aspects that Ken Miller mentioned in his talk that were taken out of the curriculum by the Kansas School Board were those parts of science that attempt to talk about our natural history. And I think, thank you, 5 minutes. And I think that we scientists need to explain to the vast majority of the American public that is not committed to a literal reading of the Bible, but that does consider itself religious, that there isn't a conflict between religion and the natural history that science is providing us. The other reason that I think science and religion are a natural partnership is that we confront challenges that require both aspects. The biggest challenge is survival of this crisis that we're going through in the next generation or two. Can you just take this transparency away for a minute and go on to the next transparency? But we'll come back to that. That one's upside down. Thank you. Okay, well, at the top you see the chart of the population. And of course, you see that the growth is faster than exponential in recent times. Next transparency, please. Let me just point out the diagram. What that's showing, the bottom curve in the diagram shows the increase in the human population from 1860 to 1991. It's about a factor of 4. The curve above that shows the growth in the energy use per capita. Energy is an example of our use of resources. And the energy use per capita has grown by approximately a factor of 20 during that same period of a little over 100 years. The result is that the impact measured just, for example, by energy use, which is the product of those two, has grown by nearly a factor of 100. Now, the population growth rate peaked in 1965 and is slowly coming down. But I don't think anybody disputes that the world cannot sustain another factor of 100 increase in our impact on the environment. And it's going to be the next generation or two that make the transition or not from our current strong emphasis on consumption to a sustainable relation to the natural world. And this is certainly an opportunity for heroism. And I regard this as a combination of a technological and a spiritual challenge. Can we go back to the previous transparency? The two transparencies ago, before the population stuff. No, back before that. Incidentally, let me thank the person, Cindy, who's, thank you very much, that's the one, who's valiantly struggling to get these right and doing very well. So are science and religion naturally antagonistic? The antagonism has only occurred in recent period, and largely in connection, in certain periods, and largely in connection with different claims concerning natural history, as I mentioned. The scientists who created modern science, such as Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, were motivated in part by religion. As Einstein said, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. Religion can be inspired by the best knowledge we have. For example, modern cosmology can nourish the spiritual imagination. Can we go on to the next transparency? These show 4 different older pictures of the universe. A traditional picture, the snake swallowing its tail, indicating the continuity of the seasons, for example. The biblical flat earth picture. It's hard to understand the beginning of Genesis without appreciating that the writers, in fact everybody in the ancient Middle East, had a flat earth cosmology in mind. So the water below is separated from the water above. The water above is held up by the firmament. Noah's flood was a breaching of the firmament and also of the fountains of the deep. So it wasn't just a rainstorm, it was a cosmic catastrophe. The medieval picture, which was of course the Ptolemaic picture, has the Earth at the center and spheres carrying the planets and the fixed stars. That was then replaced, after Galileo showed that it didn't work, by a Newtonian picture, which I'm representing here by an Escher woodcut, which just is endless space. Now, none of these are the right picture. Next transparency. Well, what is the right picture? The trouble is you can't make a picture because you can't see the universe from outside. Picture's always taken from outside. And the universe is all time as well as all space. But a snapshot is just a moment of time. And in any case, most of the universe is invisible. Even the part that is visible, in the sense that it emits photons or reflects photons, doesn't reflect photons that are just the kind that we can see, but all different wavelengths. But in any case, most of the matter in the universe is invisible dark matter, the kind of stuff I work on. So the images will have to be not literal, but symbolic. Let me just show you, to conclude, I understand I'm just about out of time, 3 symbolic images. So next. So that's one. It's concentric spheres again, and we're at the center. But this is correct. It's founded on our modern conception. What this is cosmic spheres of time. As we look out in space, in all directions, we look back in time. The nearby galaxies are those from which the light left only a few million or 100 million or so years ago. As we look farther out in space and farther back in time, we see galaxies at an earlier stage of evolution. If we look beyond about 8 billion years ago, we don't see any more big galaxies. As we look back to the first 2 billion years, the only galaxies we see are little tiny ones, bright, misshapen. Beyond that, beyond about the first billion years, we don't see any galaxies at all. If they were there, we would see them. Hubble Space Telescope, for example, could see all the way. So they aren't there. Something was there, obviously, but what we understand is that the nature of the visible matter changed tremendously over the time that we can actually see. Next transparency. Oh, sorry. You have to put that one and then the other one on top of each other. They come together. Thanks. Just like that. Okay, well, this is complicated. Let me just tell you what the key idea is. What's being plotted here is size on the horizontal scale versus mass on the vertical scale, and both of them are logarithmic. Now, it's always helpful in a complicated picture to see us. So let me just point out where we are. Right there. See, it says human. That's us. So we're right on the water line. That line represents everything that has the density of water. So that's all living organisms, from microbes through whales, but it's also planets and stars like the sun. Galaxies are much less dense, and neutron stars and white dwarfs are much more dense. There are stars even more dense than neutron stars. They're not stars anymore, they're black holes. Anything that's much smaller than a neutron star but weighs as much as a star collapses away to no size at all. So this whole region of the diagram is excluded by general relativity. Only things to the right of this green line are allowed by general relativity. The uncertainty principle excludes everything to the left of the red line. The result is that there's a smallest size called the Planck size. It's very small, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, but it's not zero. There's a largest size that we can see. That's the horizon. That's the size of the visible universe. And this snake at the bottom represents everything from the smallest size, the tail, to the largest size, the head, the Planck scale, to the Hubble radius. Next transparency, and that's the last one. Let's go back to that traditional picture of the snake swallowing its tail. This picture is due to Shelley Glashow. And visualize the universe in a different way, with all the different size scales spread out from the smallest size, the tail, around to the largest size. They're about 60 orders of magnitude, so it makes sense to use this clock face. Now, what I want to point out about this picture is that well, actually, let me start by going up to the top. The snake swallowing its tail is supposed to symbolize, this is Shelley Glashow, the Nobel Prize winner at Harvard's idea, the idea that gravity may be the controlling force on the smallest scale as well as on the largest scale. Gravity controls on the scale of mountains all the way up. Mountains are as tall as they are because that's where the force of gravity meets the electromagnetic forces that control the structure of atoms and the chemistry all the way up to the size of mountains. On small planets like Mars, mountains are taller because gravity is weaker. So electromagnetism controls at the bottom. And the hope is that maybe we'll have a unified theory of everything where gravity controls at the top. I'm just about finished. I just want to sort of talk us around the picture. So humans, things of our size, are in the middle of this kind of diagram. We're not small. We're small compared to the Hubble radius, but we're just as large compared to the smallest things. We're halfway between the size of atoms and stars, or between the size of a single cell and a planet. If you imagine that you are a cell, then it's a sort of a cozy world. You're touching another cell. The same thing if you're an atom. The electron clouds of the atoms touch each other. On the other hand, if you are a nucleus, if you try to imagine that you're a nucleus, it's a very lonely world. The nearest nucleus is 5 kilometers away, if your size sets the scale of a nucleus. If you are a star, it's a very lonely world. The nearest other person whose size is the size of a star, is in Australia. You're the only two people on Earth. If you imagine that you're a galaxy, then it becomes a little bit cozier again. The nearest galaxy would be 20 feet away in this room. If you're a supercluster, then you're touching hands with the supercluster nearby. Superclusters in the universe basically form a pattern that fills the universe. But superclusters themselves are evanescent structures. They're not held together by gravity. They're like clouds that will dissipate as the universe expands. Well, this sort of imagery, which is the best we have in trying to picture the real universe, it seems to me is a wonderful source of inspiration. When we think about things like God, traditionally, of course, all such spiritual concepts are metaphorical. They're based on taking ideas that we have and expanding them. If we think of God as an old man with a white beard, we're obviously basing that on images that are at hand. What science does is to give us an enormously larger repertoire of images. Let me just conclude by coming back to where we are on the diagram. If you're a galaxy, there's the galaxy. It takes 100,000 years for light to get across from one side to the other side. So if you're a galaxy in the 15 billion years or so that the universe has been around, you've only had time for a few thoughts. Thinking is the privilege of the creatures that live at the bottom. And what we're going to have to do is put our thinking together with the knowledge that we have of the natural world to somehow figure out how to get through this very critical period of the end of exponential expansion on Earth and figure out how to develop a sustainable relationship with the natural world. Thank you.
I'm afraid that the time has slipped here, and so I'm going to take the liberty of after our last speaker, canceling the original plan we have for allowing for some additional dialogue on the part of the speakers. We'll just say they've used up those 2 minutes, because we do want to have some time for questions from the floor. And I hope the speakers will cooperate and stay for a few minutes after the official closing time to allow a little bit more time for discussion and questions from the floor. With that, let me introduce the last speaker, Michael Ruse, distinguished philosopher of science at Guelph University in Canada, very nearby here. He has a BA in philosophy and mathematics and a master's and PhD in philosophy from McMaster and Bristol University. He's lectured in many different universities as a visiting scholar, but he is now a professor at the University of Guelph. He has numerous honors, including the Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship Award winner, also won an Isaac Walton Killam Fellowship, has an honorary doctoral degree from the University of Bergen, and was also a John Templeton Foundation Research Fellow. He has published numerous books, and I will just read a few titles to suggest the range of his interests and writing. The Darwinian Revolution, Science Read in Tooth and Claw, Taking Darwin Seriously, A Naturalistic Approach to Philosophy, Monad to Man, The Concept of Progress in Evolutionary Biology, Mystery of Mysteries, Is Evolution a Social Construction? And the book that will, if it is not already published, will be shortly, is Can a Darwinian Be a Christian? The Relationship Between Science and Religion. Please welcome Michael Ruse.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm a philosopher, so I'm totally handicapped when it comes to technology. And so I'm afraid I have neither slides nor overheads nor anything. I would like to have had a piece of chalk and a blackboard behind me, but that was not to be. I've also noticed that I seem to have failed the sartorial elegance test this evening. I notice I'm the only speaker who's not wearing a tie, and so I'm feeling particularly insecure about that. But I am also the only speaker who knows that we're not going to get that 2 minutes to go at each other, so I'm going to be particularly rude about everybody else who's spoken, because I uniquely have that opportunity. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between science and religion, particularly the relationship between Darwinism and Christianity. And I should explain that this is not intended to be a slight to other religions. And I'm sure that there are many interesting things that one might say about Darwinism and Judaism, for instance, or Islam, or other religions. But I think historically, Darwinism is a child of Christianity, and I think that this accounts for much of the tension and other things which go on. I mean, you know what children are like. At one level you love them, and at another level you can't stand the little buggers. And to a certain extent, I think that this is what is going on between Darwinism and Christianity. There's no question, certainly, but that Charles Darwin himself was deep, and I speak now as a historian, but certainly not as a particularly original historian. There's no question but that Darwin was deeply influenced by the Christian religion, I should say by the Protestant Anglican religion, in coming to his theory. So as I say, I think there are particular interests and tensions between Darwinism and Christianity. So if I talk about these only tonight, partly that is, of course, because of time limitations, but also I think there are good conceptual reasons for this. Now, the question is, can science and religion, and as I say, by science now I mean Darwinism, and by religion I mean the Christian religion, can science and religion be reconciled? Well, of course, the answer is, of course, they can. One can pretty much do anything if one wants to. The more important question, or I think the more interesting question, is can they be done without too great a cost? Can the reconciliation take place in such a way that something is left, or at least that something of some interest is left? I don't think that all who have tried to reconcile science and religion have been as sensitive to this particular issue as they might. And let me pick out mainly because I think he's somebody worth picking out. Let me pick out Stephen Jay Gould and his recent book, Rocks of Ages, where Gould talks, I think, is it magisterium, two magisteria, science and religion, Darwinism and Christianity, and basically says, of course, they can get on together and there's no problem. And of course, Gould does, in fact, effect a reconciliation. But those of you who've got through to the end of Gould's book will find that the reconciliation basically means that you're going to castrate Christianity. Basically, it means that anything of an ontological nature that Christianity wants to claim, you know, that there's a God, that this God created the universe out of nothing, that we are tainted with original sin, that Jesus Christ came and died for our sins and rose on the third day. Sorry, folks, that's all got to go. That's simply not something which can be reconciled with Gould's somewhat idiosyncratic vision of Darwinism. And basically what Gould ends up with is, for Christianity, is little more than Matthew Arnold's, emotion or sentiment enkindled with emotion. I mean, at times Gould sounds rather like one of the logical positivists of the 1930s, where basically all that's left of Christianity is a kind of, a Rotary on Sunday sort of feeling, let's all feel good together and let's not talk too much about content. Well, as I say, you can reconcile science and religion in that sort of way, but it's not much of a reconciliation. Or you can go, for instance, the John Haught route, or as Americans would say, route, and at some level, Gel Darwinism. Let me, because he beat me up afterwards, because he's much bigger than I am, and he's right here, and Gould isn't. So let me say that I have more respect for Haught on these issues than Gould, at least for the purposes of this talk. You can go, as I say, the way of John Haught, which I think is castrating Darwinism. You want to hold to a pretty healthy, full-blooded kind of religion or Christianity, and so what you do is you come up with some bastard form of evolution, something to do with Whitehead or Teilhard de Chardin or Michael Polanyi or one of these weak-kneed thinkers, anti-reductionist, wimps, wets, any other term you like to use. Well, you can do it that way, but what scientist wants that kind of reconciliation? And let me try and set my fellow panel members against each other. I imagine that poor old Ken Miller was clenching his bum when Haught was coming up with some of his suggestions for what one might want to do in the interests of reconciliation. No, I think they're more interesting and let me say, approach of integrity, which in fact has been taken by a book which will be coming out this fall. The title, I think, has already been mentioned, is to see if one can go with a pretty hardline Richard Dawkins type of ultra-Darwinism, a good red-blooded reductionism. And that's what science does today. That's what science does today. That's what goes on in Cell. That's what the triumph of the 20th century, the double helix. This is what science is. It's reductionistic right down the line. And don't think Miller isn't pushing this in his textbooks, because he is. So what the question is, can one go with a good, healthy, red-blooded Darwinism, which is reductionistic, and yet at the same time go with a Christianity which is intellectually respectable? Not only intellectually respectable, but religiously respectable. The kind of Christianity that somebody like St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas or Luther or Calvin or even John Paul II would say, well, of course I don't, there are aspects of this which I blah, 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 but basically, yes, that's Christianity as I recognize it. It's not some sort of neo-modernistic sort of view. And I think the interesting question is, can one bring those two together? Or is one going to give up because you're scared of Richard Dawkins, or you're scared of Steve Gould or Dan Dennett or something like that? And my answer is, I think that you can. I don't think it's easy. I'm not sure. I think it's an ongoing problem. I don't think that all the answers are there yet. And I think that people recognize that all the answers aren't there yet. But that's okay. Good research programs are good research programs because there's lots of work to do. I mean, when people came up with the double helix, they didn't give it up because they hadn't worked everything out from there. They said, no, this is a way to look forward. What I want to suggest to you tonight is that, in fact, it is possible to reconcile science and religion, Darwinism and Christianity, and that you don't have to give up, as it were, and go with a wimpy version of either. Now, okay, I've poured water all over the altar. Now, how do I get it lit? Let me just mention a couple of areas where I think it's possible to do something about this, or at least let me mention one in particular, because, as I say, we don't have a great deal of time: the problem of evil. The Christian is committed to the idea that we've got an all-powerful God who's all-loving, and yet at some level one has got to accept the fact of evil. Of course, Christians distinguish between two kinds of evil: moral evil, which is usually put down to original sin and failure of the will and things of this nature. And I think this raises some particularly interesting issues. And then, of course, natural evil: pain, earthquakes, cancers, and things of this nature. And why is it that an all-powerful, all-loving God allows the child to die of cancer and things of this nature? And this, of course, as we've seen, has been, by many Darwinians, been taken as not only definitive against Christianity, but by many Darwinians, they feel that their Darwinism, as it were, pours oil on something which is already burning. We saw that quote from, I think it was Dawkins, but certainly we saw the quote from David Hull, who point out that the way that Darwinism works is a struggle for existence leading to natural selection. You can't get away from it, folks. You can't hide it, that what you've got is a bloody battle. And that's the way that evolution works. And so what people like Hull say is Darwinism, if anything, makes the problem of evil even worse. And what I want to suggest is the following, is that interestingly, Richard Dawkins, of all people, I think gives us the way forward. Because what Dawkins has argued, and I think eloquently and I think properly, is that the only way you can get design is through natural selection. Dawkins has a kind of a transcendental argument of a kind, where he says, well, to get design, you cannot get design through macromutations, saltations. So that's not the way the world works. You can't get design through Lamarckism because Lamarckism is false. You can't get design through genetic drift because, well, genetic drift, the whole thing about genetic drift is it's random. The only way that you can get design is through natural selection. Now, what I would want to say is that's a very interesting conclusion. Now, let's use it as a premise, because it has always been held by Christian thinkers that God's omnipotence does not mean that God can do the impossible. No Christian thinker wants to say that God can make 2 + 2 = 5. And no Christian thinker wants to say that God, having bound upon himself or itself the evolution, the unfurling of life and everything through unbroken law. This does not mean then that God can, as it were, just play with the laws randomly, that God can do this, that, and the other, just to get the kinds of results that he wants. So if you combine these, the fact that God at some level is constrained to create through law, which seems to be, as we understand it, certainly goes back to Augustine. Certainly Augustine argues that God, of course for Augustine, God stands outside time. So the thought, the conception, and the product for God are as one. They are an unfurling through law. If you combine this absolutely central belief in Christianity with Dawkins, I think, eminently reasonable Darwinian conclusion that the only way you can get design is through natural selection, then what you have is the conclusion is that the only way in which God could have created the earth, could have created organisms, could have created humans, is through natural selection, despite the fact, or even given the fact, that this entails pain and suffering of these sorts of things. In other words, what I'm suggesting is I think that there's a way forward to argue that lets God off the theodicy hook. Because what one says is the only way you can get these is through natural selection, and as it were, pain then comes as part of the package deal, and you can't blame God for it because omnipotence does not mean that you can do the impossible. So what I want to suggest now is in a way, if you're prepared to take a hardline position on both Darwinism and Christianity, rather than, as I say, wimping out almost before you start, John Haught's not the only one. People in the science-religion area are absolutely terrified of Richard Dawkins. I mean, I know they put pins in his effigy before they go to bed at night, but and they pretend to be, no, he doesn't worry me, but he does. He scares the shit out of them. And so consequently, what you find is people backing away from Darwinism. If Darwinism is going to lead to this, well, let's go to Tired or Whitehead or something like that. No, I think the way to do it is, as it were, to make a virtue out of these people's arguments, out of my arguments. I mean, I don't want to hide. I'm an ultra-Darwinian. I think if you do it that way, then I think that there's a prospects of moving forward and some kind of reconciliation. Now, because time's limited, let me just simply say, I think this is an ongoing problem. I don't think that we've got all the answers yet, and I think that there are areas where theologians, philosophers, scientists, and others are going to have to work very hard. One area in particular, I think, is over the nature of the soul. It's an integral part of Christianity that humans have immortal souls, and at some level we are promised salvation and the possibility of eternal life. Now, I think people like Polkinghorne, I think, are right to say that if you, and let me be fair to John, I think John also has put this this evening, that if you think in some sense of intelligence and thought and souls in terms of information, I think that this fits very nicely with Darwinism, and I think that one can, in many respects, tie this into a Christian conception, perhaps not an Augustinian Platonic position, but certainly an Aristotelian position, which is that which was adopted by St. Thomas Aquinas. So as I say, I think that one can find really quite, I mean, I think if you read Steven Pinker, for instance, what is it, how the mind works, or what the mind is, there are aspects of Pinker which sound to me incredibly Aristotelian. And once you've made that move, then you're off and running. And again, I think there are good historical reasons, because Aristotle was a damn good biologist. And so Darwinians coming along are building on this. So I don't find, I mean, historically as well as conceptually, I don't find these links at all surprising. So as I say, I think that there are ways forward to think about the soul in Aristotelian terms, which I think can be interpreted in Darwinian terms. However, I do think we've still got a problem about how the soul starts. And it's interesting that John Paul II, in his very interesting letter, where he not only endorsed evolution, but basically endorsed Darwinism as well. But when it came to souls, John Paul said, but of course the origination of the soul calls for a miracle, and this is something which lies outside of science. Now, certainly what one can do, if one wants, is simply, let me not say arbitrarily, but as it were, just specify that souls came, let us say, with the arrival of Homo sapiens, wherever you want to put it, 500,000 years ago. You could certainly specify that at this point souls came into being or something like that. And one can effect a reconciliation almost by fiat. However, I think it has to be said that a Darwinian would find that, or finds that kind of resolution something which makes them incredibly uncomfortable, because Darwinism is very much a question of gradualism and evolving, and certainly Darwinism thinks of souls as being in some sense related to minds at some level, as of course Christians do as well, and certainly to consciousness, and certainly for the Darwinian, consciousness is something which evolved at least in a gradual sort of way. So as I say, I think that there are going to be tensions there. Now, tensions don't mean absolute roadblocks. I mean, there are various sorts of ways that one can start to think about this. One can start to think about the evolution of the soul. Perhaps one wants to say, well, possibly one thinks in terms of that maybe humans were not the only things with immortal souls. Perhaps that one must think, certainly to an Englishman, this comes very congenial, because I can't imagine a heaven without dogs, for instance. Certainly, I think that one's going to have to think in those sorts of terms and work, as I say, I think, together and perhaps apart, to try to resolve some of these issues. But that, I think, is the nature of inquiry. And I think it must be the nature of a science-religion inquiry and theological inquiry, because one shouldn't think that theology is necessarily cast in stone for all time. And I think that what one is going to have to do is work on these sorts of issues. So what I want to say then, in conclusion, is that I think a reconciliation is there. I think the way to go to reconciliation is by being hardline, bloody-minded, hardline Darwinian, hardline Christian, and then see if you can get a reconciliation. I think that there's a lot of scope for this. I think there's a lot of hope for this, but I still think there's some problems which have got to be worked out. Thank you.
Again, if you'd like to ask questions at this point, please step to the microphone, give the speakers a moment to get up here. And once again, I would like to ask the speakers if they wouldn't mind staying a few minutes extra, since we are close really to the official end of this. If some people are
Well, don't want you to film.
if some people want to leave, we quite understand. It's been a very long day, and I think I should explain to our speakers up here that if they didn't get the laugh responses to their punchlines that they hoped for, it's because these people have been bombarded for a week with with the speeches, and but they were keenly interested in being here tonight. And so let's give them a few minutes now for discussion. Yes, I'll move from one microphone to the other. First, the one on the right.
My name is George Casey. I'm an independent thinker and writer. I think that I feel that I don't have enough time like Chomsky with concision, because, but anyway, I'll try to make it brief. The worm or Boris in my picture has always been a sociological worm in which the civilization is actually depicted consuming itself. I think that's the dilemma that we're in, especially with the population issue. I think very interesting thesis by Riddle in his book Eve's Herbs is what opened a can of worms in that whole arena, about the role and weight of population in general. In that he was pointing out in the 16th century that generally women were able to grow herbal abortificans and amemogogs in their backyard, and that this was natural herbal birth control for thousands of years. And that talking about information and suppression of information and what that does to very directly what information does, or suppression of it to our ecology and to our environment.
Excuse me, could I interrupt you? Did you have a question for the speakers?
Question.
Okay.
I'm sorry. The chart of the population going skyrocketing after the 16th century is probably caused by the suppression of the information about herbal birth control. Now, that information was available to the sciences of the time, 15th, 14th, and before. And that information has not been available to us, so I'm almost inclined to agree with that image of the intelligence being on the last page. I'm trying to figure out where it's been ever since. Somehow it seems to be descending upon us now, hopefully soon. So my question is, can we expedite this information about the biological sciences that were available to our ancestors, specifically these old women that used to dispense herbal birth control? And would anybody like to go for that?
You have a mic right there in front of you.
Oh, okay. Oh, those are mine. Very briefly, I don't think it's true that the control of population had much to do with birth control until the 20th century. The death rate was very high before modern public health. On the other hand, I agree with the speaker's point, if that's what it was, that one of the most important things in bringing the birth rate down is education of women.
The speaker on this side.
My name is David Waltner-Taves. I'm a veterinarian and a practicing Mennonite, so I have a foot in both camps. And I'm wrestling with a conundrum that I'm not sure what to do with. When I look at the evidence on evolution, there's a process of random mutation and natural selection, and we are a product of that. And then I ask myself, how can that kind of a process lead to someone who has an objective, rational interpretation of the process that gave rise to me? And it seems to me that that's impossible. So the process of a rational observation of biology leads me to a conclusion that my ability to do that is not possible. And so I'm not sure what to do with that. And maybe Michael or somebody can help me with that. I'm sort of left with saying, if I do science, it's an act of faith. If I do religion, there's all this underlying sense of faith in something. And maybe I'm missing something because I haven't thought about it deeply enough, but maybe you can help me.
I don't think anyone's thought about it deeply enough. I'll put it this way, and that is that first of all, I think all natural scientists share a faith. And the faith that they share is ultimately the world can be figured out, the world makes sense, that there is an objective reality that can be explored, perhaps never explored in the final sense, but at least approached. With respect to the first conclusion you mentioned, that if mutation and natural selection produced us, the human mind, how can that organism produced by that process ever figure itself or figure that process out? You could take a step outside the question of evolution, and you can consider cognitive scientists who study how the brain works. And the old joke in that field is, the real question is the brain smart enough to figure out how it itself works? I have to say, though, that I don't see the link between the first statement and the second. I don't see the link between the statement, the logical link that says because mutation and natural selection produced us, therefore our own intellect is an unreliable tool to understand that process. So I don't really see the link there. I think it's certainly true that the brain being shaped by natural selection has limitations, and we all know what some of those are. And those limitations are really inherent in terms of the inherent limitations of human logic and reason, and they affect everything. But the faith that you operate on in science is that ultimately you can make some progress in understanding nature, and I think that attempt, if nothing else, is worth doing.
Yeah, I think I'd want to follow up with what Ken says. And can I just simply say to you, don't give up at this point. I mean, the last 50 years, particularly since people like Chomsky have come along and people started to work using computers and these sorts of things on brain science. I mean, this seems to me to be such a terrifically powerful and fertile research program at the moment that to say, oh, well, ontologically or psychologically or whatever it is, epistemologically, this gap can never be bridged, seems to me not something to be said at this time. I mean, if we'd had 50 years of people going around tearing their hair out and saying, we're just getting nowhere, then maybe your worries would be well taken. But this isn't the time, I think, to give up.
Well put. The question on the right, my right.
Yes, my name is John Malou, and this question is for Dr. Haught or any of the other panel members. Dr. Haught, on your first hierarchical diagram there, you demonstrated how human consciousness differentiates out of a lower type of instinctual animal level. And
that's the pre-evolutionary picture of things.
Oh, okay. That treatment, though, kind of parallels my current conference paper where I demonstrate how the higher religious virtues and values can be shown to as higher meta perspectives of a more basic type of behavioral foundation, as also described at ethicalvalues.com. My question to you is, I wanted to ask if you thought that such a basic instinctual type of behavioral foundation, in your opinion, could be compatible with, in your system, with higher spiritual values?
Oh, certainly. I think in an emergent universe, you're going to have analogies to the kind of consciousness and ethical activity that we are involved in pre-evolutionary process. Is that what you're suggesting? And the only question is whether it's sufficient to explain these things fully, let's say human virtue, human altruism, for example, as Michael does, in terms of processes which apply and are learned at a pre-human level. In other words, are you being reductionist or not, as I think Michael is. But I think you should push reduction. I would distinguish between reduction and reductionism. I think you should push reduction as far as you possibly can, but at the same time, leave an opening for the possibility that there are other explanatory elements that enter in to the process that do not show up on say, the scientific screen.
Yes, over to the left here.
Yeah, Stephen Kurtz is my name. Just a quick comment. I'm a bit surprised that none of the panelists chosen were saying that there could not be a reconciliation. Just a comment. If existence, the totality of reality, not one universe, is infinite, can there be a beginning? If there cannot be a beginning, can there be a first cause? And can you easily assert a teleology direction. In infinite possibility, anything that is must be someplace time. The last comment is, discussing all evening about souls and gods is mentioning words or symbols of which each of us has only our own imaginative conception. You may respond any way you'd like. Thank you.
May I just intervene with a response at the beginning and to the first part there? None of these speakers had to pass a test on whether or not they accepted the thesis of this panel. They were invited because they were distinguished scholars in the fields that we wanted to bring together, very disparate from theology to philosophy of science to biology and physics, and were knowledgeable and had written in this area. So we felt that their deep exploration of these issues would provide a valuable basis for a forum.
Can I just jump in on this? Because I certainly know that I'm different from at least two of the panel members here, is that I'm an agnostic, or I'm a skeptic. I'm certainly not a believer. But certainly my interest in the reconciliation certainly came out of political concerns, because I am worried about the spread of creationism in the US, and I've been much involved in this. And I've been particularly worried by my fellow Darwinians, people like Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett, who really are fouling the nest. Now, at one level, because people like Phil Johnson say, my goodness, you can't reconcile the two, and they are antithetical, and look, the Darwinians are saying this. Now, my feeling is if Darwinism does say that to you, then so be it. But I've certainly gotten involved because I wanted to say, well, one of the things I'm very much aware of is that my fellow Darwinians are about as theologically ignorant as it's possible to be. And I don't think that that's the way to solve the problem. Getting involved in it, I've just found it's a hell of a lot more interesting and a lot more of a challenge to try to reconcile them. I mean, it's easy just simply to say you can't reconcile them, end of argument. But I think certainly as a scholar, not just politically, I find it a much more exciting exercise to try to reconcile them than simply to give up before we start.
I just wanted to mention one thing about cosmology, since you raised the question about the beginning of the universe.
No, beginning of reality, not just, we could have multiverses, and if you assert that there was nothing before there was something, I'd like to know when.
These questions have long been thought to be purely metaphysical, in the sense that no evidence could possibly be relevant. And what's interesting is that there's actually now beginning to be interesting scientific evidence that is relevant. There is a class of theories for what happened before the Big Bang, which is supported by all the recent data, and that's called cosmic inflation. Now, a lot more data is going to be coming in very soon, and cosmic inflation hasn't passed all the tests that it has to. There's a satellite which is to be launched later this year by NASA called MAP, Microwave Anisotropy Probe, and there'll be a number of more experiments coming after that. But if inflation continues to pass the tests, and all the other theories have now been ruled out, inflation's basically all that we have left, and inflation makes very specific predictions. If those continue to be confirmed, then there are some further ideas along the lines of inflation that are very interesting, that have to do with how the universe began, what came before the Big Bang. This isn't the time for me to try to explain what these ideas are, and we don't even know how to test many of those ideas. But a few years ago, we didn't even know how to test inflation. Now we do, and it's passing the tests. So the main point I wanted to make is that these are interesting questions that science actually has something to say about.
Let me just comment from a theological point of view on the question of beginnings and causes. Your question reminds me of remarks that Stephen Hawking makes, that in his theory of the universe and ground state, that The fact that the universe has does not have a clear, crisp temporal beginning to him means, well, what need is there for a creator? The theological response to that is an ancient one, and that's that the doctrine of creation has nothing to do intrinsically with beginnings. It has to do with the ontological foundations of reality, so that if we wake up tomorrow and find out that the Big Bang never happened, that the steady state theory or some eternal universe is going to be the current cosmology, from a classical theological point of view, you still have the question, what is the ontological ground of reality, which is your question of reality, but you don't have to identify the question of the reality of something or the beginning of the reality of something with a temporal beginning. You can talk about it in terms of ontological foundation, as Thomas Aquinas does when he distinguishes between the first argument, the argument from causation, and the fundamental argument, the argument from the contingency, the sheer facticity of things, the sheer being of things is what's at issue here.
Okay, could we move to this side?
My name is Jeff Robbins. I'd like to address this to anyone who would care to answer on the panel. There are some people who are saying that take the evolution as a line, at least as it's led to the human species, that we are creating technologies that could, and may not be so far-fetched, be creating a successor species to ourselves. That we are delving in things that, for example, neural networks, basically giving an autonomy to technologies. And there was some concern, for example, there was an article in Wired magazine by Bill Joy that nanotechnology, robotics, and genetic engineering is maybe setting the stage for creating things that go beyond our own ability to control them, or and basically setting up stage for our own extinction. I was wondering if you might have any thoughts on this.
I'll give it a quick shot. Ever since movies first popularized the idea of the autonomous robot in the 1920s, people have been concerned about the production of technologies that in effect could think and to some degree could self-replicate. And I think we have amused ourselves, I'm not making light of what you said, but I think we've amused ourselves with science fiction, which I take as an important genre, amused ourselves with science fiction in terms of thinking what happens if these technologies get out of control. And you know, if you want to look at a current movie that I think does a brilliant job of sort of making an exposition of that point, you look at The Matrix, which is a storyline in which you have sort of a machine technology that has taken over our planet and has colonized humans. I think it's something that's important to think about, and I think that technology is a means to an end, and as the means become more powerful, our own capacity to control and to understand and to use it wisely has to grow accordingly, and human history suggests that's not always an easy thing to do. Things can get away from us. I'm not terribly concerned about this happening next year or 10 years from now, but I think ultimately what we've already learned about the human genome is going to severely tax our own common wisdom of what's ethical and moral and appropriate in a very short period of time. And I think certainly as we begin to go through the current century, and as we approach the midpoint of the century, the things you're worried about are things that people will have to consider. So I think you make some good points.
Yes, over on the left side here.
My name is Alexander Shosky, and I'm an engineer. My question relates to the contradiction between Genesis, which says that Earth was created in 6 days, and the age of Earth, a billion years, found by geologists. In one of the jokes, rich man asked God, what is 1,000 years for you? 1 moment. What is 1,000 of gold pieces for you? 1 penny. Give me this penny, wait 1 moment. So the God is beyond time. God is beyond time. We live in a time frame given to us by God. So what kind of 6 days the Genesis talks about? Is it a God's time or it's our time? Can it be 6 days, the billion years? We look at it from this perspective.
It's a good question. And I have to say that in terms of answering it, I was surprised. I had read Confessions by St. Augustine. And I had never read On the Literal Meaning of Genesis, which is another of his works. And when I wrote my own book, I was advised by, of all people, a rabbi, to sit down and read Augustine's book On the Literal Meaning of Genesis. And to my absolute astonishment, Augustine, who was not the least bit interested, as I mentioned, as being an apologist for Darwin or modern geology or anything else, Augustine himself argued that those days should not be taken as literal days. And it's not because he had any inclination to apologize it into a great age, but he had scriptural and spiritual reasons for why those days couldn't have been literal days, not the least of which is that the sun wasn't around yet. He fixed on the fact that there was light, that light was created in the Genesis account before stars and the sun. And he wondered what that could mean. And he wrote several chapters emphasizing that that light had to be understood as a spiritual light. And for Augustine, who considered himself a biblical literalist, those 6 days were not 6 literal days. And so therefore, this sort of stretching of the Genesis narrative occurred a long time before people worried about Charles Darwin and our current geological conception of the age. And it's very often been done for serious spiritual and scriptural reasons.
Let me make a couple very brief comments about the Genesis story. The light was created on the first day. Genesis gets that right. The first light, the cosmic background radiation we now call it, was the light of the Big Bang itself and came long before there were any stars. On the other hand, Genesis doesn't do so well after that. Genesis has the sun, moon, and stars created on the fourth day, but living creatures are already created before that. So the order isn't right. Also, for that matter, Genesis has the plants created before the creatures of the sea. Again, wrong. So the order's wrong. Lesson. As Augustine and many other lay and religious scholars say, the Bible is not a science textbook.
Just one more comment. There are 2 accounts of creation in Genesis, and even those don't agree with each other.
Sure.
So there should be no desire to make a literal interpretation. It wouldn't work.
Yeah,
If you want to prove to yourself that what Jack just said is right, take a piece of notebook paper, write down days 1 through 6, take Genesis 1, and in day 1, day 2, day 3, write down the events which are specified in Genesis chapter 1. Then in a parallel column, do the same thing for Genesis chapter 2, and you will discover that different events occur in different days in the 2 different accounts.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a moral here generally, is just don't get into this game at all. I've known people say, oh, well, mitochondrial Eve, now, that's going to prove Adam and Eve. The trouble is, next year somebody shows that the mitochondria don't do what you thought they were, and you're just left with egg on your face. So I think the thing is not to play this game at all. Although, I think that there are some issues here which I think are perhaps things that people interested in reconciling science and religion have to think about. I mean, if, for instance, you're going to poo-poo Adam and Eve, then how are you going to explain original sin, which is certainly a very crucial part of Christian doctrine?
A question from Stafford Beer, whom I would like to introduce to the panel. Stafford Beer is a very distinguished scholar, a founder of the system sciences and of the World Organization of the System Sciences, was an honorary co-chairperson of our World Congress of the System Sciences, and we're delighted that he came this evening, and we welcome your question.
Thank you. I would hate anything I say now to reflect on the panel. I thoroughly enjoyed all your speeches, let me say that.
But,
however, I really am totally aghast that under the heading of science and religion, you have restricted yourselves to a religion which is a mere and exactly 2,000 years old. Now, there are religions which are twice as old as that. I refer to Hinduism and many others, several others at any rate, Taoism, etc. I have been studying these religions as well as